Alan Wake 2 is just around the corner, and I for one cannot wait to see what happens next in this incredibly dark, twisted story. Now, Remedy Entertainment have stated that the sequel will work as a standalone game and that no knowledge of the original is required to play it. However, they also said that throughout the game there will be tons of lore and connections to the original story. So, if you want the lowdown on just exactly what unfolded in the original game without necessarily having to battle your way through the darkness yourself, then this is the video for you. And because we're going to be talking about the original game, plus its DLC and a couple of extras, it really should go without saying that this is going to contain a lot of spoilers, so if you plan on playing the original, you should turn off now. Meet Alan Wake, a famous best-selling author. The story starts with him and his wife Alice taking a well-earned break in a place called Bright Falls. Being the well-established author that he is, many of the residents of Brightfall immediately recognise him. One resident in particular, Rose, is a mega fan of the writer. We'll come back to her later. At the time of Wake's arrival, the town is preparing for its annual festival, which is just 2 weeks away, Deerfest. Wake needs to collect the keys for the holiday cabin that the couple are due to stay in at a place called Cauldron Lake. Wake retrieves the keys from a very mysterious old woman wearing what appears to be funeral attire. It's all a bit odd. When the happy couple reach the cabin, we discover that Wake is suffering from writer's block and that Alice has arranged all of this to help him break through said block. What a lovely thing to do. Not according to Alan though, he is furious. Feels like he's been tricked into going there. He storms out of the cabin in a rage, leaving Alice, who, by the way, is deathly afraid of the dark, on her own. A few moments later, the power is cut from the cabin, leaving poor, terrified Alice in the dark that she fears so much. Hearing Alice's screams, Wake rushes back to the cabin, only to find silence and no sign of Alice. A few seconds later, Wake witnesses his beloved wife sinking deep into the lake. Heroically and without hesitation, Wake dives in after her. We soon find Wake blacked out with a head injury, seemingly having been in a car crash in the woods in the middle of the night. Bewildered, Wake makes his way through the trees in the darkness. Along the way, he discovers some pages from a manuscript called Departure. He recognises the title and the words as his own, but has absolutely no recollection of writing them. Eventually, he gets to a logging site and meets a fella called Carl Stuckey, or just Stuckey for short. He was the chap that was originally meant to give Wake and Alice the keys to the cabin, not the weird old lady. However, something doesn't look quite right with Stuckey. He's wielding a brutal looking axe and appears to be engulfed in shadows. Suddenly, Stuckey makes a run for it. Wake chases him down only for Stuckey to try and kill him. Wake somehow manages to escape to a nearby cabin and finds a gun and a torch. Fortunately for Wake, there is a working phone, so he does what any sensible person would do, he calls the police. Well, the sheriff to be exact. Unfortunately for Wake, Stuckey has got other ideas and has found a digger which he uses to, and I'm not kidding, barge the cabin off the edge of a cliff. Wake, by the skin of his teeth, just about escapes. And so begins our protagonist's first of many long, eventful hikes through the woods in the dark. Wake encounters many shadow-like figures which he must defeat using a combination of the power of light and guns. Always guns. As Wake heads towards a nearby petrol station, he suddenly encounters our old friend Stuckey. Wake, now equipped with the weaponry that he needs, manages to kill Stuckey. But whilst at the fuel station, a sign catches Wake's attention. It states that Deerfest is now only 7 days away. Wake has mysteriously lost a week of his life. Inside the adjacent garage, a television turns on. It shows a black and white video of Wake typing on his typewriter. Could this have been how Wake had spent his missing week? Confused, Wake picks up the phone. This time, with no digger interruptions, he manages to successfully call the sheriff, who promptly turns up. He reports Alice missing, but doesn't mention anything about Stuckey because, well, you just wouldn't, would you? He tells the sheriff that he and Alice were staying on the island at Cauldron Lake. However, the sheriff, looking fairly perplexed, informs Wake that there hasn't been an island on Cauldron Lake since a volcanic eruption in the 1970s. Wake, quite rightly, doesn't believe her, so she drives him to Cauldron Lake, and lo and behold, the island is gone. We then briefly jump back in time 3 years to New York in Wake and Alice's apartment. Here we discover that Wake used to suffer nightmares as a child and also shared a fear of the dark. He recalls his mother giving him an old light switch called the clicker that he could use to scare away the monsters just by clicking the switch. It's a beautiful memory, showing Wake and Alice at a truly happy time in their life. Back to the present day, and we find Wake at the sheriff's office. Very kindly, Sarah, the sheriff, has charged his phone for him. Good job too, because he soon receives a mysterious phone call from a man telling him that if he ever wants to see his wife again, that he needs to follow his instructions. Wake does as is told and looks in the old truck in the car park. It's Alice's driving licence. Whoever this guy was, he was serious. The mystery man tells Wake to meet him at a place called Lover's Peak in Elderwood National Park at midnight. Wake then returns to the sheriff's office and runs into Dr. Emil Hartman, a local eccentric psychiatrist. Wake finds out that Hartman had been speaking with Alice before their arrival, and it was actually Hartman's idea that they visit in the first place. Wake sees red, blaming the doctor for Alice's disappearance, and promptly punches him square in the face, in the police station, in front of the sheriff. Enter scene Barry Wheeler, Wake's agent and longtime friend who's flown to Bright Falls concerned for Wake. Wake isn't under arrest, so Barry drives them to Elderwood National Park to rent a cabin overnight. Wake trusts Barry and confides in him with the truth of what had happened. Barry, understandably, doesn't believe him. He's just glad that Wake is writing again. He is his agent, after all. The pair then meet Rusty, park ranger and chap in charge of the cabins. He seems like a stand-up guy, and being the helpful park ranger that he is, provides Wake with the directions to Lover's Peak. As midnight approaches, Wake tells Barry that he can't come with him. The kidnapper was very specific that Wake be unaccompanied. Barry thinks that Wake is having some kind of mental breakdown, but concedes nonetheless. It doesn't take long before Wake's quiet, peaceful evening walk descends into chaos with the sound of gunshots and screams. Wake runs to a nearby building to find poor old Rusty in pretty bad shape. Rusty explains that he discovered a page from a manuscript that foretold the very events that had just transpired. In need of the light's protection, Rusty hands his keys to Wake to restore the power. However, upon reaching the fuse box, Wake discovers that a big old axe has been forced into it. Suddenly, screams of terror fill the air. Wake rushes back to find Rusty missing and a suspiciously large hole in the wall. Rusty, unseen, can be heard weirdly rambling about not feeding the animals. Something is not right. Suddenly, a shadow-engulfed axe-wielding maniac version of Rusty jumps Wake. It's a tough battle, but Wake comes out on top and continues toward Lover's Peak. After a lot more fighting in the shadows with torches, Wake finds himself at his destination where he meets this chap. Recognise him? He was on the ferry at the start of the story. Wake realises that this is likely Alice's kidnapper, but having dropped his gun, he has to play along. After an epic battle at Lover's Peak, Wake confronts the kidnapper. Alice will only be returned if Wake hands over his full manuscript of departure. Otherwise, Alice is in for a world of pain. The red mist descends over Wake, with the kidnapper becoming the next victim of Wake's right hook. The pair fall. Wake manages to recover the kidnapper's gun, but it's too late. The kidnapper has long gone. Wake then fights his way through the woods and eventually finds a usable vehicle. It's time to get back to Barry. As Wake approaches the cabin, he receives a follow-up phone call from the kidnapper. Wake explains that the manuscript isn't finished and that he needs time to write it. The kidnapper gives him just 2 days and tells Wake to meet him at noon at Bright Falls coal mine with the finished article. Only then would he get Alice back. We then see Barry's cabin surrounded by a murder of deadly, vicious, shadowy crows. A couple of flares later and Wake and Barry are reunited. Turns out that given everything that's just unfolded in front of him, Barry now believes Wake's story. Apologies are made and the two are BFFs once more. In an attempt to appease the kidnapper, Wake tries, unsuccessfully, to write his manuscript. Meanwhile, Barry receives a phone call from none other than Rose, the lovely Wake-obsessed waitress from the start of the game. She tells Barry that she's found the manuscript and asks the pair to come and meet her. Barry is as delighted as he is excited, but something is not quite right with Rose. It's that creepy old woman again. Something is afoot. Wake and Barry make their way to the trailer park where Rose lives. When they arrive, Wake receives a phone call from the sheriff informing him that an FBI agent named Nightingale is at the police station and is anxious to meet him. That will have to wait though, because Randolph, the trailer park owner, is on hand to take Wake and Barry to see Rose. On the way, Barry tells Wake that he's uncovered some pretty weird intel about Cauldron Lake. He tells Wake about a man named Thomas Zane, who used to be the owner of the cabin on the island. Zane was also apparently a famous writer, although Barry couldn't find anything that he had written. Barry explains that Zane was heavily into diving and that when the volcano erupted in the 1970s, it took Zane down with the island. Not only that, but a week prior to the eruption, Zane's lover, a local girl by the name of Barbara Jagger, drowned in the very same lake. According to Barry, all of this local history was written by a lady called Cynthia Weaver, who knew Zane and Jagger. We actually got a glimpse of Weaver at the start of the game before Wake collected the keys for the cabin. She was the lady in the diner, cradling a lantern whilst murmuring about the dangers of the dark. Rose answers the door, still seemingly possessed by the darkness. She invites them both in for a nice cup of coffee. All is not as it seems though. Rose's specialty coffee contains a blend of the world's finest coffee beans and finest drugs, which quickly knocks out both Barry and Wake. Wake regains consciousness sometimes later. Hours have passed and it's dark outside. On the television, we hear one of Wake's monologues where we discover that Barbara Jagger is in fact the creepy old lady in the funeral attire. She was apparently editing the manuscript that Wake was writing during his missing week of time. She promised Wake that if he finished the manuscript, he would save Alice. Barry is still fully knocked out and Rose is sitting rocking back and forth on the floor like a crazy person. Wake heads outside to retrieve the car in the hope that he can load an unconscious Barry inside it. As he approaches the gate, he is met by the sheriff and Agent Nightingale. Trailer park owner Randolph had called the cops. He suspected that something untoward had happened with Rose and that Wake and Barry were to blame. This is the first time we get a glimpse of the type of FBI agent that Nightingale is, and, truth be told, he's a little unhinged. He's the type of guy to shoot first and ask questions later. He is, as Randolph describes him, a maniac. Wake manages to escape. The police pursue him for a while but end up getting distracted by the fact that the mysterious dark presence has now turned its attention to them. Pretty convenient as far as Wake is concerned, as it gives him opportunity to make his way to the local radio station, where he hopes to obtain directions for the coal mine. This is where we run into radio presenter Pat Main. You may recognise him from, you've guessed it, the ferry into Bright Falls at the start of the game. Unfortunately, Pat is on air when Wake arrives and announces his arrival live to his audience. And since that radio station is the only thing that the good people of Bright Falls listen to, it doesn't take long for Agent Nightingale to appear on the scene, gun in hand, firing away like there's no tomorrow. Luckily for Wake and Pat, he appears under the influence and is a terrible shot, allowing Wake to escape once more. Wake then finds himself at a local train yard, fighting off yet more shadowy figures that we now know are called the Taken. He eventually finds another conveniently positioned, fully fueled, keys at the ready vehicle, which he uses to escape both the shadowy figures and the night. Now, with the protection of daylight, Wake drives to the coal mine where the kidnapper is due to meet him. Hours pass. Much to Wake's frustration, the kidnapper is a no-show, and before you know it, nighttime returns. Later on, the kidnapper calls Wake with a change of plan. He tells Wake to meet him at Lookout Point at Mirror Peak, which is a big mountain to the north. Wake, now fueled by anger and determination, fights his way through the mine's train yard and up the mountain, having all kinds of horrors thrown at him, occasionally quite literally. Thanks to another TV monologue, we learn a little bit more about Thomas Zane. He was a poet, a good one, and wrote of creators summoning fabulous things from a magical lake. He believed Cauldron Lake was a mystical gateway and that he could use it to shape the world around him. But he also feared it, speaking of how his lover was consumed by darkness when he attempted to bring her back to life, and how that darkness desired to spread itself into the wider world. Wake continues to fight through the mine shafts of the mountain, eventually reaching Lookout Point. He discovers the kidnapper, whose name we find is actually Mott, on his knees begging for forgiveness. He doesn't have Alice, and he never did. He mutters that he didn't know who he was dealing with and that he was only following orders from the boss, whoever that might be. Barbara Jagger briefly flashes into existence before the dark presence rips Mott off his knees and into the air, killing him. It attempts to do the same to Wake, however Alan manages to grab and light a flare, causing the dark presence to drop him into the water below. As Wake descends into darkness, a mysterious man extends his hand and appears to rescue Wake from the water. Wake starts to regain consciousness but finds himself in the care of Dr. Emil Hartman, who still has the plaster over his nose from their last meeting. Hartman explains that Wake has been under his care for some time and is suffering from a mental breakdown after the death of Alice. Despite Hartman's best efforts, Wake is not convinced. However, he has none of his tools and no chance of escape, so until such a time presents itself, he has to play along. Hartman gives Wake a tour of the facility, which is where we run into brothers Odin and Tor Anderson. We briefly met the pair at the diner at the start of the game. In the 1970s, they formed an awesomely named rock band called the Old Gods of Asgard, but were now supposedly suffering from the advanced stages of dementia. This may well be true, as they constantly confuse Wake with Thomas Zane. However, they tell Wake about their old farm, Valhalla, and how it contains information prudent to the strange goings-on in the area. They also make reference to a special homebrew drink that will clear your head right up and make you remember. Suddenly, a storm causes a power cut to the building and Wake is told to go back to his room. He passes another one of those monologue TVs, which is where we find out a little bit more about Barbara Jagger. In his writing, Wake refers to her as a dark presence wearing the old woman's face, and that there is a hole in her chest where her heart should be. Wake comes to the conclusion that his writing is not getting him any closer to saving Alice, and that Jagger is instead using him to get the story that she, well, the dark presence, wants. In the hope that Wake would use it, Hartman has left a typewriter in Wake's room and told him that it would be good for him if he did. Wake attempts to do so but finds the white of the paper blinding. Suddenly, chaos sounds from downstairs, resulting in Wake's minder leaving him to go and investigate. One of the Anderson brothers has hit Nurse Sinclair with a hammer, with her keys now lying on the floor. Opportunities like this don't come around often, so Wake takes the keys and heads to Hartman's office to retrieve his manuscript. On the way, Wake discovers an audio tape interview between Hartman and Alice. He also spots a photograph on the wall of Dr. Hartman and Mott, the kidnapper. This is when Wake realises the depth of Hartman's deception. The doctor had cut parts of the audio tape to make the phone call to Wake pretending to be Alice. Mott worked for Hartman. He was the boss that Mott had referred to previously. All this time, Hartman had been attempting to trick Wake so that he could take advantage of the power behind his writing. As Wake approaches Hartman's office, he can hear shouting coming from within. It's Barry. The police had to let him go at Rose's. He hadn't done anything after all. It turns out that Hartman had called Barry and told him that Wake was at his facility. When Barry arrived, Hartman's heavies clobbered him and stuck him in the office, complete with a stolen Wake cutout from Rose. Moments later, Wake finally gets to confront Hartman, who desperately tries to convince Wake to join him in his plan for creation. But it's too late for the Doctor, who is suddenly consumed by the dark presence. Wake escapes once again, this time with a slight smile on his face after the demise of Hartman. Wake manages to fight his way out of the facility and meets back up with Barry, who hands him his trusty torch. The whole building is now engulfed in shadows. Wake must make his escape via a maze in the garden. After some pretty intense, heart-stopping battles, Wake finally gets to face off with the taken version of Hartman and his army of crows. It's a tough battle, but Wake just about pulls through. Soon after, Barry comes to Wake's rescue with his car and the cardboard cutout. Wake tells Barry that he is convinced that Alice is trapped at the bottom of the lake, but alive. He explains that the lake can make works of art come true, but that the dark presence twists things to its own ends. It's trying to use Wake's manuscript to take over everything. Barry's fully on board at this point and believes him. Wake tells him about the Anderson brothers Odin and Tor. They, much like Thomas Zane, had experienced all of this before. Wake tells Barry of a message that the brothers have left at their farm, and that that's where they needed to go next. Unfortunately, a well-timed landslide causes the car to career off the edge of the road and down a cliff. Miraculously, both are seemingly uninjured but have been separated. Wake has also lost his gun and torch, meaning that he must dodge all the things that the darkness throws at him, like Neo in the Matrix. It's not long though before Wake finds a torch and makes his way towards the farm. Along the way, we get another glimpse of that mysterious fella in the lit up diving suit. We discover that it was he that has been leaving the pages of the manuscript for Wake to follow. We also find out, via another television monologue, that the dark presence has been using Alice like a carrot on a stick to get to Wake. Realising that he must write himself into the story as the protagonist, Wake becomes determined to write an end in which Alice survives, even if it's at his own demise, and that he will use Thomas Zane to make it happen. Eventually, after defeating yet another possessed earth-moving machine, Wake arrives at the Andersons' farm and is reunited once again with Barry. The disused farm still has the stage set up from Odin and Tor's last gig. Wake realises that he and Barry can use the stage to defeat the Taken in what is probably my favourite scene in the whole game. It is an epic battle backed with some truly great music, courtesy of the Anderson brothers. After some exploring and a disagreement with a combine harvester, Wake and Barry arrive at the farmhouse. They restore power to the building, which in turn starts a record player. Wake realises that the message the brothers had left for him was in the form of that particular song. The song, The Poet and the Muse, refers to a lady of the light. Could it be that Cynthia Weaver, Lamp Cradler, is the key to all of this? Wake and Barry agree to rest for the night in the safety of the working lights. Barry even finds a couple of bottles of the brothers' home brew. The potent alcoholic drink contains unfiltered water from Cauldron Lake, which perhaps explains the effects it begins to have on Wake. He suddenly finds himself in an out-of-body experience where he witnesses the truth about what happened to Alice at the cabin. This is where we get confirmation that the dark presence had indeed made Wake their puppet, convincing Wake that it was his fault that Alice died, but that if he listened to Jagger, he could write Alice back to life. Indeed, Wake spent that missing week trapped underwater in the cabin writing the manuscript to Departure. Despite Jagger's best efforts, there was still a small part of Wake that was aware of what was happening to him, enough for him to write his own escape into the story. He wrote that the escape would occur just before he finished the novel and that it would be Zane that would set him free. That mysterious man that had come to Wake's aid previously was Zane. We then see a very disoriented Wake escape to his car, which he would then later crash, leading onto all of the events that we had witnessed so far. Quickly jumping back to the farm, Alan is suddenly woken by a very drunk and very angry Agent Nightingale. Confined behind bars at the sheriff's station, Wake has a vision of Cynthia Weaver. She is mumbling about someone coming for something when the time is right, and that Thomas Zane wrote about it. Cynthia has something special, something she keeps safe in the light. Wake must get to Cynthia, but more pressing matters are at hand. Agent Nightingale now has the manuscript and is convinced he has all the evidence that he needs to prosecute Wake for conspiracy to murder a federal agent. The Dark Presence has other ideas though and devours him in front of the sheriff, Wake and Barry. The trio manage to restore power to the station, which is when the sheriff tells Wake that Cynthia Weaver lives in an old decommissioned power plant and that she can get Wake there pretty sharpish via the Force's helicopter. The sheriff and Wake head off to prepare the chopper whilst Barry stays behind to call a list of people on the sheriff's behalf. The duo make their way through the festival-ready town, which is increasingly succumbing to the darkness. They fight their way through hordes of Taken and eventually meet back up with Barry, who has decorated himself in Christmas lights in the hope that it will act like garlic to a vampire. Wake, Barry and the sheriff all make it to the helicopter. However, the sheriff needs time to get it ready to fly. More Taken suddenly burst onto the scene. Wake must defend the chopper whilst the final preparations are made. They eventually manage to take off and fly toward the disused power plant. As they arrive, shadowy crows attack the helicopter, throwing Wake out of it and forcing the sheriff to abort the landing. Wake must make the rest of the journey on foot, although this time he does have the assistance of the ultra-bright searchlight from the chopper. Eventually he arrives at the door of Cynthia Weaver. She's been waiting for Wake for a very long time. She explains that the item Wake needs to drive away the darkness is in something called the well-lit room, and that was on the other side of the plant. Cynthia even has her own secret tunnel which she and Wake could use to get to the other side. As they make their way, Cynthia confirms that she knew Zane and Jagger, and that Zane was indeed a very famous writer. The reason why Barry couldn't find anything that he'd authored was because Zane had wrote himself out of existence in an attempt to undo what he had unwittingly done. Zane had only left one thing in the world, an item that he'd entrusted to Cynthia should the dark presence resurface. Wake and Cynthia start to make their way across the tunnel, and Wake calls Barry to explain the plan. Unfortunately, the call is cut short with the sound of the helicopter crashing. Cynthia pleads with Wake to stay on course, but Wake will not abandon his friend. Cynthia tells Wake that he is a fool and that should he make it, she will meet him at the other side. Wake must, once again, fight his way through the woodland with his trusty torch and guns. Always guns. He finds the downed chopper, but no sign of Barry or the sheriff. Suddenly, there are gunshots. Wake races up the hill to find them fighting off a large number of Taken. Wake turns the table of battle and the trio escape up a lift to the top of the dam. Jagger summons all kinds of destruction, forcing Wake to run for his life, narrowly avoiding death numerous times. Eventually he reaches a bright light at the end of the dam. It's another lift, this time with Cynthia inside it. As the lift descends, Cynthia explains that she's been somewhat obsessively looking after the well-lit room. It is quite literally a giant old safe room filled with lights. In the centre of the room is a box. Wake opens the box and discovers that the item inside is none other than the clicker that his mother gave to him as a boy. Zane had written it into Wake's life as a young lad so that if the time came, he could use it to help defeat the dark presence. It was in this moment of absolute clarity that Wake realised what he needed to do. Wake tells the sheriff and Barry that he's going back to the lake to finish things, to write an ending to the story that will make things right. The manuscript's final page is already loaded in the typewriter in the cabin under Cauldron Lake. Only there can Wake finish Departure. Only there will his writing take shape. Emotional farewells are made as Wake leaves the power plant, clicker in hand. Surprisingly, it's actually daytime for a change in Bright Falls as Wake drives towards Cauldron Lake. He soon reaches a block in the road and all of a sudden all hell breaks loose. Daytime becomes nighttime and the Taken attack Wake. The dark presence was no longer trying to capture Wake. He knew too much and he was carrying a weapon that could destroy it. The dark presence was now doing whatever it could to stop Wake. Things were about to get ugly. Wake fights his way toward the lake, killing and destroying everything that the dark presence throws at him. As he gets closer, Jagger summons her most destructive weapon yet, a giant swirling tornado of death. Wake dodges, dips, ducks, dives and dodges all the way to the edge of the lake and stares into the abyss below him. Clicker in hand, he makes the leap of faith and dives into the water. Wake then finds himself in bed with Alice. She tries to convince him that this has all just been one big dream. However, his New York apartment is surrounded by shadows and Wake is having none of it. He knows it's another attempt by the dark presence to deceive him. He finds the clicker on the living room table and activates it. Thomas Zane then floats into the scene and tells Wake he must find his way to the cabin. Zane tells Wake that the dark presence has no heart, the void is filled with darkness. If Wake is to be victorious, he must fill that void with light. We then get a glimpse of Mr. Scratch, Wake's doppelganger. Zane quickly tells Wake not to worry about him and that his friends will meet him when he's gone. It's all a bit mysterious. Undeterred and with torch in hand, Wake travels through the strange, nightmarish, dark reality of the lake, eventually reaching the cabin. We see the void in Jagger's chest. She tells him that he will never get Alice back and that she is much older and more powerful than he is. Suddenly, Wake thrusts his clenched fist into Jagger's chest and activates the clicker. Light consumes her and the cabin. The dark presence looks to be destroyed. Wake sees his typewriter with the unfinished final page of his manuscript still loaded inside it. Wake realises that the lake demands a balance of all things. This was something that Zane had never understood. If Alice were to be freed, Wake would have to stay. After a small passage of time, Wake finishes departure and we see Alice swim up to the surface of the water. He had done it. She was saved. In the penultimate scene of the game, we see Bright Falls in the throes of Deerfest. Those that were consumed by the dark presence had now returned, and for the most part they were happy. As the camera pans around the various characters, it focuses on Rose. She's carrying a lit lantern. As the focus shifts, we then see a very ominous looking Agent Nightingale in the background. Could the game be hinting at a new Lady of the Light and a new face for the dark presence? It suddenly cuts back to Wake in the cabin. The game finishes with him saying,
"It's not a lake. It's an ocean."
Alan, wake up.
Soon after the original game was released, we were treated to a couple of DLCs called The Signal and The Writer. In them, Wake remains trapped in the dark place, and it's driving him crazy, to the point that he has split himself into two versions. A logical, clear-thinking Wake and a fearful, self-doubting Wake. The lesser of the two versions of himself wants to give in. He can't take the dark place any longer. The logical version of Wake is the version that you play in the DLC, helped by none other than Thomas Zane. Once again, he guides Wake to the light, allowing Wake to regain control of himself. Once he does, he begins to write his escape from the dark place, his next novel, Return.
My name is Alan Wake, and I'm a writer.
Alan Wake's American Nightmare follows on from the DLC. It's not truly a sequel, it's more of a sidestep involving one of my favourite antagonists of all time, Mr. Scratch. If you recall, Mr. Scratch appeared at the end of the original game just before Wake saved Alice. You can think of Wake's doppelganger as a little like Barbara Jagger, another of Zane's creations, this time as a step-in for Wake in the real world. But in doing so, the dark place twisted Zane's creation into something altogether different. Mr. Scratch is a sadistic murderer. He is a manifestation of all the awful rumours surrounding Wake's disappearance. Wake is desperate to stop Mr. Scratch, save his loved ones and free himself from the dark place, and he plans to do all of this using one of his old episodes of Night Springs. Mr. Scratch is trying to prevent the sun from ever rising again and even creates a time loop in an attempt to trap Wake. However, each time Wake attempts to defeat Mr. Scratch, he learns a little more. Basically, it's a Groundhog Day horror plot. Eventually though, through the power of a drive-in cinema projector, Wake defeats, or at least significantly weakens, Mr. Scratch, and looks to have escaped the dark place. Or has he? That brings us on to Control, and in particular the Alan Wake DLC. An organisation called the Federal Bureau of Control, or FBC for short, is based somewhat invisibly in New York. They investigate paranatural activity, in particular things called objects of power and altered world events, or AWEs. The events at Bright Falls were classed as an AWE and were investigated by the Federal Bureau of Control just after the Alan Wake story concluded. We find that Wake is indeed alive, but remains trapped in the dark place trying to right his escape. The plot of Control is complex and never really gives you a 100% concrete answer to anything. Some people believe that Wake created everything in Control as part of his plan to escape the dark place. Personally, I think that's a misconception. It seems most likely that the FBC, their headquarters named the Oldest House, and the characters within Control were already very much alive and real. Wake merely nudges and directs events through his writing rather than being some kind of all-powerful creator. The small alterations he writes into his stories may only be little, but they go a long way to reshaping events in the future. So why does any of this matter? Well, lots of things are revealed about Bright Falls and its inhabitants throughout the Control DLC. We find that Alice Wake has been haunted multiple times by Wake, or more likely his doppelganger, Mr. Scratch. Alice even managed to take a photograph of him in her apartment. As a result, Alice visited the Oldest House to assist the FBC's investigation, but whilst there, inadvertently triggered the escape of something codenamed SI-1. SI-1 turns out to be none other than Dr. Emil Hartman. He was detained by the FBC after the events of Bright Falls, but was later released after being deemed a negligible threat. Frustrated that the FBC had revoked his medical license, confiscated his research, and, with seemingly nothing left to lose, Hartman threw himself into Cauldron Lake, convinced he'd get a better outcome than Wake and Zane previously. Misunderstanding what he'd got himself into, Hartman was consumed by the Dark Presence and became one of the Taken. He is eventually captured by the FBC and detained indefinitely inside the Bright Falls AWE section within the Oldest House. Meanwhile, a self-propagating resonance named the Hiss has started to invade the FBC headquarters and a large number of its staff. For the sake of simplicity, just think of the Hiss as an alien lifeform. It's not quite that simple, but you get the idea. The Dark Presence and the Hiss combine within Hartman, amplifying one another, eventually transforming him into an abomination referred to as the Third Thing. The lead character of Control, Jessie Faden, is contacted by Wake clairvoyantly at the start of the DLC. She eventually defeats Hartman's new form in a long drawn-out battle. At the conclusion of that particularly brutal fight, a report is received of a new altered world event in Bright Falls. But it's not happening now, it's happening a few years in the future. Could this be what Wake and Zane have been working on? It seems to me like this is most likely where Alan Wake 2 will pick up from. There are still plenty of questions that remain unanswered, and I can't wait to get stuck into them when the game arrives on October the 27th. You can be sure of more Alan Wake related content when that day arrives, but until then, if you like what you've seen and you haven't played the original game, you really should. It is fantastic and well worth your time. So if you got this far, thank you for sticking with me. Please do let me know if you think I've missed anything. And if you enjoyed the video, please do like and subscribe. Oh, and if you're interested in my thoughts on whether the perfect computer game exists, you should check out my previous video. Thank you.